Indicators is a very important data collection program and program of analysis and, of course, sharing and interpreting data nationwide that's currently implemented in 46 states. And it's an initiative that is really conducted by HSRI, NASDDDS, and University of Minnesota, and specifically the Institute on Community Integration, has worked with those two organizations since 1997 on this particular data set. It's the only real national data set for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities that's collected at this scale and pretty much annually. It is a random sample, which means that every year a different set of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are asked the same or very similar questions. And the questions relate to not only their personal characteristics, like, for example, some of the basic things like do they have employment, or what kind of services do they receive, but also some of the more complex outcomes about community inclusion, community living, goals, dreams, and things like that, that really states and also nationally we can track over time. We have a team of researchers who get the data every year from HSRI and NASDs, and then we analyze the data. And so really the team tends to have expertise in research and data analysis, but also they're very familiar with services and outcomes for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so what we do, we answer specific questions that may be really important for policymakers, for family members, caregivers, and of course, people with disabilities themselves. And the questions we may ask is, what is the proportion of people with intellectual disabilities who also have a secondary diagnosis of autism, and what percentage of those have employment? How many of those people are happy with their living situation, for example? We also ask questions about how many of those people that answer the questions can answer the questions by themselves. Because as you can imagine, people who have more severe disabilities or have a secondary disability of, say, autism or dementia, the behavioral disorder, they will not possibly be able to answer the questions by themselves. So how many of them need a proxy respondent, caregiver, or somebody they choose to answer the questions for them? We also look at what are some of the factors in the data set, for example, their age, be it secondary disability, be it mobility, be it behavior, have an effect on their outcomes like community living and employment. Because those are things that matter not only to the individual with a disability and their providers and caregivers, but ultimately it also matters to policymakers, and it affects the decisions that they make about where people with disabilities should live and where they should work. And that's how a lot of the policies and laws have been developed and been enforced, from the Olmstead Act and others, like, for example, the HCBS final rule. They have drawn a lot on the results on the work that we do with National Core Indicators. One of the findings is that there is about a little bit over half of the participants in the NCI survey that are able to answer the questions by themselves, meaning there are individuals with IDD who have secondary disabilities that require a proxy respondent, meaning a caregiver or someone else to answer the questions so that the questions are reliable and valid. The other set of findings is to do with residential settings, for example. So NCI has shown, and our analysis of NCI has shown over the years, that the smaller and more community-based residential setting is for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, the better the outcomes generally are. So, for example, people who live in their own apartment or with a family member, or a very small group home, 1 to 3 residents, and tend to have better choices. And that's everyday choices, but also choices that are more long-term. They generally are more satisfied with their services and similar outcomes to that. They also tend to have better and more employment. If an individual with an intellectual developmental disability has a secondary diagnosis of autism, they are about 30% less likely to have employment than, for example, a person with IDD who does not have autism as a secondary diagnosis. Those are some individual findings, of the different questions that we ask and studies that we do within that particular project. And there have been some sort of overarching findings that we know that there are always factors that matters, never mind what question we ask, be it about employment, be it about community living. So we know that the level of intellectual disability, the level of mobility, and also whether the person can express themselves or not verbally makes a difference in the outcome that we are studying. So that's more of a general finding. This data set is really the only data set that we can use to compare individuals with IDD across states, for example, across regions in the US, which is very important because if you want to make a policy or amend a policy, you cannot just base it on the results from a certain city or certain states. So this is really a big advantage of this work. One thing we have learned that we analyze the data annually as they come in, as HSRI and ISD shares them with us. But we also learned that because each year they ask these questions of different individuals, we cannot do true longitudinal analysis, which means that we cannot really say that in 2008, the results were such, and in 2018, there was an improvement or not so much in that sense, because we are not really looking at the same individuals. Other countries, such as Australia, Denmark, UK, have the luxury of longitudinal data sets. And so one of the lessons is we really do strive to collect longitudinal data with national indicators and our partners to be able to do some of this longitudinal work. Of course, we want to continue. We do have a nice history from 1997 doing this work with those organizations that we partner with. And we really would like to look at not just the longitudinal trends that I described, but also trends in the outcomes that we study, such as choices, community living, employment, satisfaction with services, and see what kind of patterns we are seeing based on changes in policy, changes in laws, and other things that happen in states and nationally, so that we can really provide the public with the picture that they deserve.